Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
Negative character, or the social, political, and economic consequences. The argument so far has been aimed at showing that benefits from colonialism were small, and that they were not gifts from the colonialists, but rather fruits of African labor and resources for the most part. Indeed, what was called the development of Africa by the colonialists was a cynical shorthand expression for the intensification of colonial exploitation in Africa to develop capitalist Europe. The analysis has gone beyond that, to demonstrate that numerous false claims are made purporting to show that Europe developed Africa in the sense of bringing about social order, nationalism, and economic modernization. However, all of that would still not permit the conclusion that colonialism had a negative impact on Africa's development. In offering the view that colonialism was negative, the aim is to draw attention to the way that previous African development was blunted, halted, and turned back. In place of that interruption and blockade, nothing of compensatory value was introduced. The colonization of Africa lasted for just over 70 years in most parts of the continent. That is an extremely short period within the context of universal historical development. Yet it was precisely in those years that, in other parts of the world, the rate of change was greater than ever before. As has been illustrated, capitalist countries revolutionized their technology to enter the nuclear age. Meanwhile, socialism was inaugurated, lifting semi-feudal, semi-capitalist Russia to a level of sustained economic growth higher than that ever experienced in a capitalist country. Socialism did the same for China and North Korea, guaranteeing the well-being and independence of the state, as well as reorganizing the internal social arrangements in a far more just manner than ever before. It is against those decisive changes that events in Africa have to be measured. To mark time, or even to move slowly while others leap ahead, is virtually equivalent to going backward. Certainly in relative terms, Africa's position vis-a-vis its colonizers became more disadvantageous in the political, economic, and military spheres. The decisiveness of the short period of colonialism and its negative consequences for Africa spring mainly from the fuel that Africa lost power. Power is the ultimate determinant in human society, being basic to the relations within any group and between groups. It implies the ability to defend one's interests and, if necessary, to impose one's will by any means available. In relations between peoples, the question of power determines maneuverability in bargaining, the extent to which one people respect the interests of another, and, eventually, the extent to which a people survive as a physical and cultural entity. When one society finds itself forced to relinquish power entirely to another society, that in itself is a form of underdevelopment. During the centuries of pre-colonial trade, some control over social, political, and economic life was retained in Africa, and in spite of the disadvantageous commerce with Europeans. That little control over internal matters disappeared under colonialism. Colonialism went much further than trade. It meant a tendency towards direct appropriation by Europeans of the social institutions within Africa. Africans ceased to set indigenous cultural goals and standards, and lost full command of training young members of the society. Those were undoubtedly major steps backward. The Tunisian Albert Memmi puts forward the following proposition. The most serious blow suffered by the colonized is being removed from history and from the community. Colonization usurps any free role in either war or peace, every decision contributing to his destiny and that of the world, and all cultural and social responsibility. Sweeping as that statement may initially appear, it is entirely true. The removal from history follows logically from the loss of power which colonialism represented. The power to act independently is the guarantee to participate actively and consciously in history. To be colonized is to be removed from history, except in the most passive sense. A striking illustration of the fact that colonial Africa was a passive object is seen in its attraction for white anthropologists who came to study primitive society. Colonialism determined that Africans were no inurer makers of history than were beetles. objects to be looked at under a microscope and examined for unusual features. The negative impact of colonialism in political terms was quite dramatic. Overnight, African political states lost their power, independence, and meaning, irrespective of whether they were big empires or small polities. Certain traditional rulers were kept in office, and the former structure of some kingdoms was partially retained, but the substance of political life was quite different. Political power had passed into the hands of foreign overlords. Of course, numerous African states in previous centuries had passed through the cycle of growth and decline, but colonial rule was different. So long as it lasted, not a single African state could flourish. To be specific, it must be noted that colonialism crushed by force the surviving feudal states of North Africa, that the French wiped out the large Muslim states of the Western Sudan, as well as Dahomey and kingdoms in Madagascar, that the British eliminated Egypt, the modest Sudan, Asante, Benin, the Yoruba kingdoms, Swaziland, Matabeleland, the Lozi, and the East African Lake kingdoms as great states. It should further be noted that a multiplicity of smaller and growing states were removed from the face of Africa by the Belgians, Portuguese, British, French, German, Spaniards, and Italians. Finally, those that appeared to survive were nothing but puppet creations. For instance, the Sultan of Morocco retained nominal existence under colonial rule, which started in 1912, and the same applied to the Bey of Tunis. But Morocco and Tunisia were just as much under the power of French colonial administrators as neighboring Algeria, where the feudal rulers were removed altogether. Sometimes the African rulers who were chosen to serve as agents of foreign colonial rule were quite obviously nothing but puppets. The French and the Portuguese were in the habit of choosing their own African chiefs. The British went to Iboland and invented warrant chiefs, and all the colonial powers found it convenient to create superior or paramount rulers. Very often, the local population despised such colonial stooges. There were traditional rulers such as the Sultan of Sokoto, the Kabaka of Uganda, and the Asante Hene of Asante, who retained a great deal of prestige in the eyes of Africans, but they had no power to act outside the narrow boundaries laid down by colonialism, lest they find themselves in the Seychelles Islands as guests of His Majesty's government. One can go so far as to say that colonial rule meant the effective eradication of African political power throughout the continent, since Liberia and Ethiopia could no longer function as independent states within the context of continent-wide colonialism. Liberia, in particular, had to bow before foreign political, economic, and military pressures in a way that no genuinely independent state could have accepted, and although Ethiopia held firm until 1936, most European capitalist nations were not inclined to treat Ethiopia as a sovereign state, primarily because it was African, and Africans were supposed to be colonial subjects. The pattern of arrest of African political development has some features which can only be appreciated after careful scrutiny and the taking away of the blinkers which the colonizers put on the eyes of their subjects. An interesting case in point is that of women's role in society. Until today, capitalist society has failed to resolve the inequality between man and women, which was entrenched in all modes of production prior to socialism. The colonialists in Africa occasionally paid lip service to women's education and emancipation, but objectively there was deterioration in the status of women owing to colonial rule. A realistic assessment of the role of women in independent pre-colonial Africa shows two contrasting but combined tendencies. In the first place, women were exploited by men through polygamous arrangements, designed to capture the labor power of women. As always, exploitation was accompanied by oppression, and there is evidence to the effect that women were sometimes treated like beasts of burden, as for instance in Muslim African societies. Nevertheless, there was a counter-tendency to ensure the dignity of women to greater or lesser degree in all African societies. Mother right was a prevalent feature of African societies, and in particular, women held a variety of privileges based on the fact that they were the keys to inheritance. More important still, some women had real power in the political sense, exercised either through religion or directly within the political constitutional apparatus. In Mozambique, the widow of an Nguni king became the priestess in charge of the shrine set up in the burial place of her deceased husband, and the reigning king had to consult her on all important matters. In a few instances, women were actually heads of state. Among the Lovedo of Transvaal, the key figure was the Rain Queen, combining political and religious functions. The most frequently encountered role of importance played by women was that of Queen Mother, or Queen Sister. In practice, that post was filled by a female of royal blood, who might be mother, sister, or aunt to the reigning king in places such as Mali, Asante, and Buganda. Her influence was considerable, and there were occasions when the Queen Mother was the real power and the male king a mere puppet. What happened to African women under colonialism is that the social, religious, constitutional, and political privileges and rights disappeared, while the economic exploitation continued and was often intensified. It was intensified because the division of labor according to sex was frequently disrupted. Traditionally, African men did the heavy labor of felling trees, clearing land, building houses, apart from conducting warfare and hunting. When they were required to leave their farms to seek employment, women remained behind, burdened with every task necessary for the survival of themselves, the children, and even the men as far as foodstuffs were concerned. Moreover, since men entered the money sector more easily and in greater numbers than women, women's work became greatly inferior to that of men within the new value system of colonialism. Men's work was modern, and women's was traditional and backward. Therefore, the deterioration in the status of African women was bound up with the consequent loss of the right to set indigenous standards of what work had merit and what did not. One of the most important manifestations of historical arrest and stagnation in colonial Africa is that which commonly goes under the title of tribalism. That term, in its common journalistic setting, is understood to mean that Africans have a basic loyalty to tribe rather than nation, and that each tribe still retains a fundamental hostility towards its neighboring tribes. The examples favored by the capitalist press and bourgeois scholarship are those of Congo and Nigeria. Their accounts suggest that Europeans tried to make a nation out of the Congolese and Nigerian peoples, but they failed, because the various tribes had their age-long hatreds, and as soon as the colonial power went, the natives returned to killing each other. To this phenomenon, Europeans often attached the word atavism to carry the notion that Africans were returning to their primitive savagery. Even a cursory survey of the African past shows that such assertions are the exact opposite of the truth. It is necessary to discuss briefly what comprises a tribe, a term that has been avoided in this analysis, partly because it usually carries derogatory connotations, and partly because of its vagueness and the loose ways in which it is employed in the literature on Africa. Following the principle of family living, Africans were organized in groups, which had common ancestors. Theoretically, the tribe was the largest group of people claiming descent from a common ancestor at some time in the remote past. Generally, such a group could therefore be said to be of the same ethnic stock, and their language would have a great deal in common. Beyond that, members of a tribe were seldom all members of the same political unit, and very seldom indeed did they all share a common social purpose in terms of activities such as trade and warfare. Instead, African states were sometimes based entirely on part of the members of a given ethnic group, or more usually, on an amalgamation of members of different ethnic communities. All of the large states in 19th century Africa were multi-ethnic, and their expansion was continually making anything like tribal loyalty a thing of the past, substituting in its place national and class ties. However, in all parts of the world, that substitution of national and class ties for purely ethnic ones is a lengthy historical process. Invariably, there remains for long periods certain regional pockets of individuals who have their own narrow regional loyalties springing from ties of kinship, language, and culture. In Asia, the feudal states of Vietnam and Burma both achieved a considerable degree of national homogeneity over the centuries before colonial rule, but there were pockets of tribes or minorities who remained outside the effective sphere of the national state and the national economy and culture. In the first place, colonialism blocked the further evolution of national solidarity because it destroyed the particular Asian or African states which were the principal agents for achieving the liquidation of fragmented loyalties. In the second place, because ethnic and regional loyalties, which go under the name of tribalism, cannot be effectively resolved by the colonial state, they tended to fester and grow in unhealthy forms. Indeed, the colonial powers sometimes saw the value of stimulating the internal tribal jealousies so as to keep the colonized from dealing with their principal contradiction with the European overlords, that is, the classic technique of divide and rule. Certainly, the Belgians consciously fostered that. The racist whites in South Africa had by the 1950s worked out a careful plan to develop the oppressed African population as Zulu, as Xhosa, and as Sotho, so that the march towards broader African national and class solidarities could be stopped and turned back. The civil war in Nigeria is generally regarded as having been a tribal affair. To accept such a contention would mean extending the definition of tribe to cover Shell oil and Gulf oil. But quite apart from that, it must be pointed out that nowhere in the history of pre-colonial independent Nigeria can anyone point to the massacre of Igbos by Xhosas, or any incident which suggests that people up to the 19th century were fighting each other because of ethnic origin. Of course, there were wars, but they had a rational basis in trade rivalry, religious contentions, and the clashes of political expansion. What came to be called tribalism at the beginning of the new epoch of political independence in Nigeria was itself a product of the way that people were brought together under colonialism so as to be exploited. It was a product of administrative devices, of entrenched regional separations, of differential access by particular ethnic groups into the colonial economy and culture. Both Uganda and Kenya in East Africa are also situations in which a supposedly tribal factor continued to be preeminent. There is no doubt that the existence of the Buganda kingdom within independent Uganda posed certain problems. But even after misapplying the definition of a tribe to the Baganda, it still remains true that the Buganda problem was a colonial problem. It was created by the presence of the missionaries and the British, by the British Mailo land settlement in Uganda in 1900, and by the use which Britain made of the Baganda ruling class as sub-imperialists within the colony of Uganda. In Kenya, the pattern of colonialism was different from that of Uganda because of the presence of white settlers. No African group was allowed any power in the capacity of NCOs for the colonial office, since the white settlers themselves filled the role. The white settlers took the best land and then tried to create a new world with African labor. However, the African community, which lay outside the immediate white settler sector, was regulated along tribal lines. One of the numerous royal commissions of British colonialism published a report on Kenya in 1934. A contemporary Kenyan historian commented on the report as follows: "The commission's recommendations, which were accepted by the British government, implied that Kenya was to be partitioned into two racial blocks, African and European, and in the African sector, all economic, social, and political developments were to be conducted on tribal lines. Racialism thus became institutionalized." Human activity within small groups, connected only by kinship relations, such as the tribe, is a very transient phase, through which all continents passed in the phase of communalism. When it ceased to be transient and became institutionalized in Africa, that was because colonialism interrupted African development. That is what is implied in Memmi's reference to Africans being removed from history. Revolutionary African thinkers such as Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral expressed the same sentiments somewhat differently when they spoke of colonialism having made Africans into objects of history. Colonized Africans, like pre-colonial African chattel slaves, were pushed around into positions which suited European interests and which were damaging to the African continent and its peoples. In continuation, some further socio-economic implications of that situation will be examined. Pre-colonial trade had started the trend of the disintegration of African economics and their technological impoverishment. Colonial rule sped up that trend. The story is often told that in order to make a telephone call from Accra in the British colony of the Gold Coast to Abidjan in the adjacent French colony of Ivory Coast, it was necessary to be connected first with an operator in London and then with an operator in Paris who could offer a line to Abidjan. That was one reflection of the fact that the Gold Coast economy was integrated into the British economy, and the Ivory Coast economy was integrated into the French economy, while the neighboring African colonies had little or no effective economic relations. The following conclusions, reached by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in 1959, goes directly to the point. The most outstanding characteristic of the transportation systems of Africa is the comparative isolation in which they have developed within the confines of individual countries and territories. This is reflected in the lack of links between countries and territories within the same geographical sub-region. Some African trade did persist across colonial boundaries. For instance, the centuries-old trade in kola nuts and gold from the forests of West Africa to North Africa never completely ceased. Besides, new forms of African trade developed, notably with regards to supplying foodstuffs to towns or cash crop areas where there was insufficiency of food. That kind of trade could be entirely within a colony, or it could cross colonial boundaries. However, the sum total of energy that went into expansion of inter-African trade was extremely small in comparison with trade that was export-oriented. Since this inter-African trade did not bring benefits to Europeans, it was not encouraged by them, and up to the latter part of the colonial period, only 10% of Africa's trade was internal. It is also worth noting that Africa was denied the opportunity of developing healthy trade links with parts of the world other than Europe and North America. Some trade persisted across the Indian Ocean, but on the whole, it is fair to say that the roads in Africa led to the seaports, and the sea lanes led to Western Europe and North America. That kind of lopsidedness is today part of the pattern of underdevelopment and dependence. The damaging impact of capitalism on African technology is even more clearly measurable in the colonial period than in the earlier centuries. In spite of the slave trade and of the import of European goods, most African handicraft industries still had vitality at the start of the colonial period. They had undergone no technological advance, and they had not expanded, but they had survived. The mass production of the more recent phase of capitalism virtually obliterated African industries such as cloth, salt, soap, iron, and even pottery making. In North Africa, handicraft industries had made the greatest advances before colonialism in spheres ranging from brasswork to woolens. As in the towns of feudal Europe, craft workshops flourished in Algerian towns like Oran, Constantine, Algiers, and Tlemcen. But French colonialism destroyed the handicraft industries and threw thousands out of work. The same thing had happened in Europe itself, when new machines threw artisans out of employment in places like Lancashire and Lyons. But in that instance, the new machines became the basis of the prevailing mode of production, and formerly independent artisans returned to factories as proletarians to master different skills and expand the productive capacity of their society. In Africa, it was simply destruction without redress. By the time political independence was achieved, surviving craftsmanship had been turned towards attracting tourists rather than meeting the real needs of African people. Besides, as was true of the European slave trade, the destruction of technology under colonialism must be related to the barriers raised in the path of African initiative. The vast majority of Africans drawn into the colonial money economy were simply providing manual labor, which stimulated perspiration rather than scientific initiative. Africans connected to the trading sector were sometimes successful in a limited way. The resourcefulness of West African market women is well known, but it was put to petty purposes. The problem posed to capitalists and workers in Europe while making insecticide from African pyrethrum was one requiring that resourcefulness be expressed in a technical direction. But the problem posed to an African market woman by the necessity to make a penny more profit on every tin of imported sardines was resolved sometimes by a little more vigor, sometimes by a touch of dishonesty, and sometimes by resort to juju. Colonialism induced the African ironworker to abandon the process of extracting iron from the soil and to concentrate instead on working scraps of metal imported from Europe. The only compensation for the interruption would have been the provision of modern techniques in the extraction and processing of iron. However, those techniques were debarred from Africa on the basis of the international division of labor under imperialism. The non-industrialization of Africa was not left to chance. It was deliberately enforced by stopping the transference to Africa of machinery and skills which would have given competition to European industry in that epoch. In the period of African development preceding colonialism, some areas moved faster than others and provided the nuclei for growth on a wide regional basis. Northern Nigeria was one of those, and it virtually went to sleep during the colonial period. The British cut it off from the rest of the Muslim world and fossilized the social relations so that the serfs could not achieve any change at the expense of the ruling aristocracy. On every continent and within nation-states, some features of growth were always more outstanding than others, and thereby offered a lead to the rest of the society. The towns played that role in late feudal European society, while the electrical industry was an example of a similar impetus for development in metropolitan capitalist society in the first decades of this century. Colonialism provided Africa with no real growth points. For instance, a colonial town in Africa was essentially a center of administration rather than industry. Towns did attract large numbers of Africans, but only to offer them a very unstable life, based on unskilled and irregular employment. European towns had slums, but the squalor of towns in underdeveloped countries is a special phenomenon. It was a consequence of the inability of those towns to play the role of expanding the productive base. Fortunately, Africa was never as badly off in this respect as Asia and Latin America. Instead of speeding up growth, colonial activities such as mining and cash crop farming sped up the decay of traditional African life. In many parts of the continent, vital aspects of culture were adversely affected. Nothing better was substituted, and only a lifeless shell was left. The capitalist forces behind colonialism were interested in little more than the exploitation of labor. Even areas that were not directly involved in the money economy exploited labor. In extracting that labor, they tampered with the factor that was the very buttress of the society. For African traditional life, when deprived of its customary labor force and patterns of work, was no longer traditional. During the colonial era, many thinly populated villages appeared in Central and Southern Africa, comprising women, children, and old men. They practiced subsistence agriculture, which was not productive enough, and colonialists contrasted them with cash crop areas, which in comparison were flourishing. However, it was precisely the impact of colonialism which left so many villages deserted and starving because the able-bodied males had gone off to labor elsewhere. Any district deprived of its effective laboring population cannot be expected to develop. There were several spots within different colonies which were sufficiently far removed from towns and colonial administration that they neither grew cash crops nor supplied labor. In southern Sudan, for instance, there were populations who continued to live a life not dissimilar to that which they had followed in previous centuries. Yet even for such traditional African societies, the scope for development no longer existed. They were isolated by the hold which the colonialists had on the rest of the continent. They could not interact with other parts of Africa. They were subject to increasing encroachment by the money economy and were more and more to be regarded as historical relics. The classic example of this type of obstructed historical development is to be found in the United States, where the indigenous population of Indians, who survived slaughter by the whites, were placed in reservations and condemned to stagnation. Indian reservations in North America are living museums to be visited by white tourists who purchase curios. In South Africa and Rhodesia, the policy of establishing native reserves was openly followed. Inside a reserve, the major means of production was the land, but the quantity and fertility of the land allocated was entirely inadequate to support the numbers of Africans who were driven in. The reserves were reservoirs of cheap labor and dumping grounds for those who could not be accommodated within the money economy of the racist southern section of Africa. Further north, there were no areas named as reserves, except in colonial Kenya, and to a very limited extent in Tanganyika. But the money economy was constantly transforming the traditional sector into one which was just as deprived as any reserve. The money economy of colonialism was a growing sector. That is not to be denied. However, it has already been indicated how limited that growth was, viewed over the continent as a whole. The growth in the so-called modern sector exercised adverse effects on the non-monetary sector. What remains is to emphasize that the character of growth in Africa under colonialism was such that it did not constitute development. That is, it did not enlarge the capacity of the society to deal with the natural environment, to adjudicate relations between members of the society, and to protect the population from external forces. Such a statement is already implicitly borne out in the inability of capitalism to stimulate skilled labor in colonial Africa. A system which must stand in the way of the accumulation of skills does not develop anything or anybody. It is implicit, too, in the manner in which Africa was cut into economic compartments, having no relation one to another, so that even though the volume of commercial activity within each compartmentalized colony may have increased, there was no development comparable to that which linked together the various states of the United States. In recent times, economists have been recognizing in colonial and post-colonial Africa a pattern that has been termed growth without development. That phrase has now appeared as the title of books on Liberia and Ivory Coast. It means that goods and services of a certain type are on the increase. There may be more rubber and coffee exported, there may be more cars imported with the proceeds, and there may be more gasoline stations built to service the cars. But the profit goes abroad, and the economy becomes more and more a dependency of the metropoles. In no African colony was there economic integration or any provision for making the economy self-sustained and geared to its own local goals. Therefore, there was growth of the so-called enclave import-export sector, but the only things which developed were dependency and underdevelopment. A further revelation of growth without development under colonialism was the overdependence on one or two exports. The term monoculture is used to describe those colonial economies which were centered around a single crop. Liberia, in the agricultural sector, was a monoculture dependent on rubber, Gold Coast on cocoa, Dahomey and southeast Nigeria on palm produce, Sudan on cotton, Tanganyika on sisal, and Uganda on cotton. In Senegal and Gambia, groundnuts accounted for 85 to 90% of money earnings. In effect, 2 African colonies were told to grow nothing but peanuts. Every farming people have a staple food, plus a variety of other supplements. Historians, agronomists, and botanists have all contributed to showing the great variety of such foods within the pre-colonial African economy. There were numerous crops which were domesticated within the African continent. There were several wild food species, notably fruits, and Africans who had shown no conservatism in adopting useful food plants of Asian or American origin. Diversified agriculture was within the African tradition. Monoculture was a colonialist invention. Those who justified the colonial division of labor suggest that it was natural and respected the relative capacities for specialization of the metropoles and colonies. Europe, North America, and Japan were capable of specializing in industry, and Africa in agriculture. Therefore, it was to the comparative advantage of one part of the world to manufacture machines, while another part engaged in simple hoe culture of the soil. That kind of arrogant partition of the world was not new. In the 15th century, the feudal monarchies of Portugal and Spain wanted the whole world for themselves, and they got the Pope to draw a line around the globe, making the allocations. But Britain, Holland, and France suggested that they were not at all convinced that Adam had left a will which gave the earth to Portugal and Spain. In like manner, it can be questioned whether there is any testament which stated that the river Gambia should inherit groundnut growing, while the river Clyde of Scotland should become a home of shipbuilding. There was nothing natural about monoculture. It was a consequence of imperialist requirements and machinations, extending into areas that were politically independent in name. Monoculture was a characteristic of regions falling under imperialist domination. Certain countries in Latin America, such as Costa Rica and Guatemala, were forced by United States capitalist firms to concentrate so heavily on growing bananas that they were contemptuously known as banana republics. In Africa, this concentration on one or two cash crops for sale abroad had many harmful effects. Sometimes, cash crops were grown to the exclusion of staple foods, thus causing famines. For instance, in Gambia, rice farming was popular before the colonial era, but so much of the best land was transferred to groundnuts that rice had to be imported on a large scale to try to counter the fact that famine was becoming endemic. In Asante, concentration on coca raised fears of famine in a region previously famous for yams and other foodstuff. Yet the threat of famine was a small disadvantage compared to the extreme vulnerability and insecurity of monoculture. When the crop was affected by internal factors such as disease, that amounted to an overwhelming disaster, as in the case of Gold Coast cocoa when it was hit by swollen shoot disease in the 1940s. Besides, at all times, the price fluctuations, which were externally controlled, left the African producer helpless in the face of capitalist maneuvers. From a capitalist viewpoint, monocultures commended themselves most because they made colonial economies entirely dependent on the metropolitan buyers of their produce. At the end of the European slave trade, only a minority of Africans were sufficiently committed to capitalist exchange and sufficiently dependent upon European imports to wish to continue the relationship with Europe at all costs. Colonialism increased the dependence of Africa on Europe in terms of the numbers of persons brought into the money economy and in terms of the number of aspects of socio-economic life in Africa which derived their existence from the connection with the metropole. The ridiculous situation arose by which European trading firms, mining companies, shipping lines, banks, insurance houses, and plantations all exploited Africa, and at the same time caused Africans to feel that without those capitalist services, no money or European goods would be forthcoming, and therefore Africa was in debt to its exploiters. The fact of dependency made its impact felt in every aspect of the life of the colonies, and it can be regarded as the crowning vice among the negative social, political, and economic consequences of colonialism in Africa, being primarily responsible for the perpetuation of the colonial relationship into the epoch that is called neo-colonialism. Finally, attention must be drawn to one of the most important consequences of colonialism on African development, and that is the stunting effect on Africans as a physical species. Colonialism created conditions which led not just to periodic famine, but to chronic undernourishment, malnutrition, and deterioration in the physique of the African people. If such a statement sounds widely extravagant, it is only because bourgeois propaganda has conditioned even Africans to believe that malnutrition and starvation were the natural lot of Africans from time immemorial. A black child with a transparent rib cage, huge head, bloated stomach, protruding eyes, and twigs as arms and legs, was the favorite poster of the large British charitable operation known as Oxfam. The poster represented a case of kwashiorkor, extreme malignant malnutrition. Oxfam called upon the people of Europe to save starving African and Asian children from kwashiorkor and such ills. Oxfam never bothered their consciences by telling them that capitalism and colonialism created the starvation, suffering, and misery of the child in the first place. There is an excellent study of the phenomenon of hunger on a world scale by a Brazilian scientist, Josué de Castro. It incorporates considerable data on the food and health conditions among Africans and their independent pre-colonial state or in societies untouched by capitalist pressures, and it then makes comparisons with colonial conditions. The study convincingly indicates that the African diet was previously more varied, being based on a more diversified agriculture than was possible under colonialism. In terms of specific nutritional deficiencies, those Africans who suffered most under colonialism were those who were brought most fully into the colonial economy, namely the urban workers. For the sake of the doubters, several de Castro's observations are listed here. 1. Investigators who have studied the nutritional conditions of primitive Africans in tropical Africa are unanimous in stating that they show no clinical signs of dietary deficiency. One of the most striking indications of the superiority of indigenous African diet is the magnificent condition of the teeth. One researcher among 6 ethnic groups in Kenya could not find a single case of tooth decay, not a single deformation of dental arch. But when those same people were transplanted and put on the civilized diet available under colonialism, their teeth began to decay at once. 2. In Egypt, the peasants, or fellahin, had always suffered from periodic famines, but under colonialism this deteriorated to become chronic hunger. It was the intervention of the British which upset the balance of the peasants' diet, and comparison with early accounts shows that there was once a much greater variety of legumes and fruits. 3. The kwashiorkor of the Oxfam posters is itself noticeable wherever the African's contact with the European was prolonged. A committee on nutrition in the colonial empire found a noticeable absence of animal fat and protein in the Gambia. The absence of proteins of good quality is one of the principal contributors to kwashiorkor, and once again, comparison with what Europeans saw in the Gambia ever since the 15th century would indicate that a change had come about after the coming of the whites. The Gambia not only grew a variety of food in the early period, but it was stock-raising country, where meat was consumed in considerable quantity. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, cattle hides were sold by the thousands to European buyers every year, and the local population ate the meat. How then could they have suffered from an absence of animal fat? 4. Studies in equatorial Africa have revealed frequent signs of dietary deficiencies caused by the absence of fresh foods among Africans entering the service of the colonizers. These include beriberi, rickets, and scurvy. Rickets is a typical temperate climate disease, to which lack of sun contributes. But after colonialism had so destroyed the pattern of judicious food consumption in tropical Africa, even the sun was not enough to keep children's bones straight. As for scurvy, that is so closely identified with the English sailor that he was nicknamed Limey from eating limes to prevent scurvy while lacking access to fresh food on long sea voyages. However, a scurvy epidemic broke out in the middle of Tanganyika in the colonial epoch, among workers in the gold fields, whose wages and conditions of work did not permit them to get fresh citrus and other nourishment. 5. In South Africa, white settlement and capitalism transformed African diet from meat and cereal to dependence on mealie meal, maize. Pellagra, or rough skin, was unknown in South Africa until about 1914. Subsequently, it became a scourge among Africans because it derives from absence of milk and meal. 6. An official report on Basutoland, now Lesotho, had this to say: according to residents of long standing, the physique and health of the Basuto today is not what it used to be. Malnutrition is seen in every village, dispensary, school, and recruiting office. Mild scurvy and subscorbic conditions are not infrequent. Pellagra is becoming more and more frequent, and lower resistance to disease increasingly apparent. It is becoming generally accepted, too, that the occurrence of leprosy is associated with faulty diet. To clinch the argument that colonialism had a deleterious effect on the African as a physical and hence mental entity, it is useful to point to those African peoples who, until today, have managed to maintain their own pattern of existence in so far as food is concerned. The pastoral Maasai, Gala, Ankoli, Batutsi, and Somali are all in that category. Their physique is generally so superb, their resistance and endurance so great, that they have become the objects of scientific research to discover why they do so much better than the well-fed capitalists who are collapsing from heart disease. In the light of the prevailing balance sheet concept of what colonial rule was about, it still remains to take note of European innovations in Africa, such as modern medicine, clinical surgery, and immunization. It would be absurd to deny that these were objectively positive features, however limited they were quantitatively. However, they have to be weighed against the numerous setbacks received by Africa in all spheres due to colonialism, as well as against the contributions Africa made to Europe. European science met the needs of its own society, and particularly those of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie did not suffer from hunger and starvation. Bourgeois science therefore did not consider those things as needs which had to be met and overcome, not even among their own workers, and least of all on behalf of Africans. This is just a specific application of the general principle that the exploitation of Africa was being used to create a greater gap between Africa and capitalist Europe. The exploitation and the comparative disadvantage are the ingredients of underdevelopment. Education for underdevelopment. Education is crucial in any type of society for the preservation of the lives of its members and the maintenance of the social structure. Under certain circumstances, education also promotes social change. The greater portion of that education is informal, being acquired by the young from the example and behavior of elders in the society. Under normal circumstances, education grows out of the environment, the learning process being directly related to the pattern of work in the society. Among the Bimba of what was then northern Rhodesia, children by the age of 6 could name 50 to 60 species of 3 plants without hesitation, but they knew very little about ornamental flowers. The explanation is simply that knowledge of the trees was a necessity in an environment of cut-and-burn agriculture and in a situation where numerous household needs were met by tree products. Flowers, however, were irrelevant to survival. Indeed, the most crucial aspect of pre-colonial African education was its relevance to Africans, in sharp contrast with what was later introduced. The following features of indigenous African education can be considered outstanding: its close links with social life, both in a material and spiritual sense, its collective nature, its many-sidedness, and its progressive development in conformity with the successive stages of physical, emotional, and mental development of the child. There was no separation of education and productive activity or any division between manual and intellectual education. Altogether, through mainly informal means, pre-colonial African education matched the realities of pre-colonial African society and produced well-rounded personalities to fit into that society. Some aspects of African education were formal, that is to say, there was a specific program and a conscious division between teachers and pupils. Formal education in pre-colonial Africa was also directly connected with the purposes of society, just like informal education. The programs of teaching were restricted to certain periods in the life of every individual, notably the period of initiation or coming of age. Many African societies had circumcision ceremonies for males or for both sexes, and for some time before the ceremonies, a teaching program was arranged. The length of time involved could vary from a few weeks to several years. A famous example of the latter was the initiation school held by the Poro Brotherhood in Sierra Leone. Formal education was also available at later stages in life, such as on the occasion of passing from one age grade to another, or of joining a new brotherhood. Specialized functions such as hunting, organizing religious ritual, and the practice of medicine definitely involved formal education within the family or clan. Such educational practices all dated back to communal times in Africa, but they persisted in the more developed African feudal and pre-feudal societies, and they were to be found on the eve of colonialism. As the mode of production moved towards feudalism in Africa, new features also emerged within the educational pattern. There was, for instance, more formal specialization, because the proportion of formal to informal education increases with technological advance. Apart from hunting and religion, the division of labor made it necessary to create guilds for passing down the techniques of ironworking, leather making, cloth manufacture, pottery molding, professional trading, and so on. The emphasis on military force also led to formal education in that sphere, as in the case of Dahomey, Rwanda, and Zulu, cited earlier. A state structure with a well-defined ruling class always encouraged the use of history as a means of glorifying the class in power. So, in the Yoruba state of Ketu, in the 19th century, there existed a school of history, where a master drilled into the memories of his pupils a long list of the kings of Ketu and their achievements. Of course, reliance on memory alone placed several limits on education of that type, and that is why education was much more advanced in those African countries where the use of writing had come into being. Along the Nile, in North Africa, in Ethiopia, and the Western Sudan, and along the East African coast, a minority of Africans became literate, producing a situation comparable to that of Asia and Europe before the latter part of the 19th century. As in other parts of the world, literacy in Africa was connected with religion, so that in Islamic countries it was a Quranic education, and in Christian Ethiopia the education was designed to train priests and monks. Muslim education was particularly extensive at the primary level, and it was also available at the secondary and university levels. In Egypt, there was the Al-Azhar University, in Morocco, the University of Fez, and in Mali, the University of Timbuktu, all testimony to the standard of education achieved in Africa before the colonial intrusion. The colonizers did not introduce education into Africa. They introduced a new set of formal educational institutions which partly supplemented and partly replaced those which were there before. The colonial system also stimulated values and practices which amounted to new informal education. The main purpose of the colonial school system was to train Africans to help man the local administration at the lowest ranks and to stall the private capitalist firms owned by Europeans. In effect, that meant selecting a few Africans to participate in the domination and exploitation of the continent as a whole. It was not an educational system that grew out of the African environment, or one that was designed to promote the most rational use of material and social resources. It was not an educational system designed to give young people confidence and pride as members of African societies, but one which sought to instill a sense of deference towards all that was European and capitalist. Education in Europe was dominated by the capitalist class. The same class bias was automatically transferred to Africa. To make matters worse, the racism and cultural boastfulness harbored by capitalism were also included in the package of colonial education. Colonial schooling was education for subordination, exploitation, the creation of mental confusion, and the development of underdevelopment. A European-type school system hardly operated during the first 40 years or so of colonialism. In that period, missionaries gave schooling for their own Christianizing purposes, and it was in the 1920s that the colonizing powers carried out a series of investigations into educational possibilities in Africa. Thereafter, colonial education became systematic and measurable, though it approached its maximum dimensions only in the post-Second World War era. Colonial education was a series of limitations inside other limitations. The first practical limitation was politicio financial, which means that political policy, rather than the actual availability of money, guided financial expenditure. The metropolitan governments and their African administrations claimed that there was not enough money for education. As late as 1958, the British Colonial Office said of Northern Rhodesia, "Until more money becomes available for the building of schools, no rapid progress can be expected, and the practical prospects of providing full primary education for all children, therefore, remains fairly remote." It is amazing that Northern Rhodesia, with its immense copper wealth, did not have enough money to educate Africans. One cannot be certain whether the colonialists were trying to deceive others, or whether they had succeeded in fooling themselves. Probably most of the confused white settlers in the Rhodesias fell into the latter category, for they consistently argued that Africans did not pay as much tax per head as Europeans, and therefore Africans could not expect to get education and other services out of taxes paid by white settlers. This is the fundamental failure to perceive that a country's wealth comes not from taxes, but from production. African soil and African labor in northern Rhodesia produced vast wealth, but African children under colonialism had little access to that wealth for their schooling. As noted earlier, most of Africa's surplus was exported, and out of the small portion which remained behind as government revenue, the percentage channeled into education was tiny. In every colony, the budget for education was incredibly small, compared to amounts being spent in capitalist Europe itself. In 1935, of the total revenue collected from taxing Africans in French West Africa, only 4.03% was utilized on education. In the British colony of Nigeria, it was only 3.4%. In Kenya, as late as 1946, only 2.26% of the revenue was spent on African education. By 1960, those percentages had gone up 2, 3, or 4 times, but being so small to begin with, they still remained insignificant. Since such small sums were spent, it followed that another basic limitation was quantitative, in the sense that very few Africans made it into schools. In the whole of French Equatorial Africa, Chad, Central African Republic, Gabon, and Congo-Brazzaville, there were only 22,000 pupils enrolled in 1938, and that represented quite a jump over figures for the preceding 5 years. In 1938, the French provided education for 77,000 pupils in French West Africa, with a population of at least 15 million. A very illuminating fact that should be noted is that in 1945, there were more than 80,000 students attending independent Islamic schools in French West Africa, a number not far short of those attending French-built schools by that date. In other words, it was only in the final stages of colonialism that the ruling European power began to provide Africans in the former Islamic states of West Africa with educational institutions, having an enrollment greater than that of the previous formal education. Occasionally, in West and North Africa, the French government gave some financial support to the Quranic primary schools and to the madrasas, or Islamic secondary schools. On the whole, however, the pre-colonial African school system was simply ignored, and it tended to decline. In Algeria, the Arab Islamic institutions of learning suffered severely during the French wars of conquest, while others were deliberately suppressed when the French gained the upper hand. Throughout French North Africa, the old established Islamic universities suffered because colonialism deprived them of the economic base which previously gave them support. As with so many other aspects of African life, what the colonialists put in must be weighed against what they halted and what they destroyed in both real and potential terms. British colonies tended to do an average somewhat better than French ones with regard to educational activities, largely because of missionary initiatives rather than the British government itself. Ghana, Nigeria, and Uganda were fairly well off as far as colonial education went. Of course, that was in a purely relative sense, and the absolute numbers involved were never large. Sierra Leone was better off educationally than French West Africa, because the 7 out of every 100 children going to school in Sierra Leone before the last war compared favorably with 5 out of every 100 in French West Africa. As far as the British are concerned, their slightly superior record in some colonies is also offset by the very poor educational facilities offered to Africans in Kenya, Tanganyika, the Central African Territories, and South Africa itself, which was for a long time a British responsibility. One limitation of the educational system of colonial Africa, which is obscured by statistical averages, is the great variation in opportunity between different regions in the same colony. In many colonies, only Africans living in or near the principal towns had educational opportunities. For instance, in Madagascar, the capital town of Tananarive had the most substantial school facilities. In Gambia, literacy was high for Bathurst town, but low outside. And in Uganda, the urbanized region of Buganda practically monopolized education. Generally speaking, the unevenness in educational levels reflected the unevenness of economic exploitation and the different rates at which different parts of a colony entered the money economy. Thus, in Gold Coast, the Northern Territories were neglected educationally because they did not offer the colonialists any products for export. In Sudan, it was the huge southern region which was in a similar position. Inside Tanganyika, a map showing the major cotton and coffee areas, virtually coincides with a map showing areas in which colonial education was available. It means that those whom the colonialists could not readily exploit were not offered even the crumbs of education. The closer one scrutinizes the educational contribution of colonialism, even in purely quantitative terms, the more it shrinks into insignificance. It must be noted, for instance, that there was an extremely high rate of dropouts. A large percentage of those enrolled never finished school. In big capitalist countries like the United States, there are many dropouts at the college and university level. In colonial Africa, the dropouts were occurring at the primary level, at a rate as high as 50%. For every student who completed primary school, one fell by the wayside. The dropouts were from primary schools because there was hardly any other type of school. This absence of secondary, technical, and university education being yet another of the stumbling blocks. Africans were being educated inside colonial schools to become junior clerks and messengers. Too much learning would have been both superfluous and dangerous for clerks and messengers. Therefore, secondary education was rare, and other forms of higher education were virtually non-existent throughout most of the colonial epoch. That which was provided went mainly to non-Africans. As late as 1959, Uganda spent about £11 per African pupil, £38 per Indian, and £186 on each European child, the difference being due largely to the availability of secondary education for the children of the capitalists and the middlemen. In Kenya, the discrimination was worse, and the number of European children involved was high. In 1960, more than 11,000 European children were attending school in Kenya, and 3,000 of those were receiving secondary education. The settler colony of Algeria displayed similar characteristics. Only 20% of the secondary pupils in 1954 were denoted as Muslims, which meant in effect Algerian as distinct from European. Other minorities also did better than the indigenous population. For instance, the Jews in North Africa, and especially in Tunisia, played the middlemen roles, and their children were all educated right up to secondary standards. African countries without a big white settler population also had racist educational structures with regards to opportunities at all levels, and especially opportunities for higher education. In Senegal, in 1946, the high school had 723 pupils, of whom 174 were Africans. Later on, a university was set up in Dakar to serve the whole of French West Africa. And yet in the 1950s, on the eve of independence, more than half of the university students were French. The Portuguese have not been discussed so far because there is scarcely any education to be discussed in their colonial territories. For many years, the statistical data were never made available, and when published towards the end of the colonial period, the figures were often inflated. What is undeniable is that the African child growing up in Portuguese colonial territories stood one chance out of 100 of getting instruction beyond grade 2 or grade 3. The secondary schools that came into existence were for Europeans and Indians, the latter drawn mainly from Goa. The colonial powers with small territories in Africa were Spain and Italy, like Portugal. They were also backward from a European capitalist viewpoint, and they provided their colonial subjects with a tiny amount of primary education and no secondary education. Belgium was in a somewhat special category as far as colonial education was concerned. Although small, Belgium was a relatively developed and industrialized country, and it ruled one of the richest areas of Africa, namely the Congo. By colonial standards, the people of Congo and Rwanda-Urundi had fair access to primary education, but schooling beyond that was almost impossible to obtain. This was the consequence of a deliberate policy pursued by the Belgian government and the Catholic Church. The African native was to be gradually civilized. To give him secondary education was like asking a young child to chew meat when he should be eating porridge. Furthermore, the Belgians were so interested in the welfare of the African masses that they argued that no highly educated African would be able to serve his own people. Consequently, it was only in 1948 that a Belgian commission recommended the establishment of secondary schools for Africans in the colonies. It is not at all surprising that at the time of regaining political independence, the Congo had only 16 graduates out of a population of more than 13 million. Educators often refer to the educational pyramid, comprising primary education as the base and going upwards through secondary, teacher training, higher technical, and university facilities, the last named being so small that it could be represented as the point at the top of the pyramid. Throughout Africa, the primary base was narrow, and yet the pyramid sloped shallowly because so few of the primary students could continue beyond that level. Only in certain British colonies was the pyramid really completed by significant higher and university education. West Africa had Achimota and Yaba colleges, apart from Forough Bay, which was at university level. Ibadan and the University of Ghana also came into existence some years before the end of the colonial regime. In the Sudan, there was Gordon College, which evolved into the University of Khartoum, and in East Africa, there was Makerere University. The following data for the year 1958 could be used to illustrate the educational pyramid in southern Rhodesia, where African education was not well favored. Total kindergarten enrollment was 227,000. In the primary schools, 77,000 entered grade 1, and 10,000 made it to grade 6. Secondary education began with 3,000 pupils, of whom only 13 made it to grade 12. In that year, there were no African graduates from the recently established University College in Salisbury, but by 1960 there were 3. The final word on the quantity of education provided by Europe to Africa can be said in the form of the statistics at the beginning of the rule of the new African states. Some scholars have worked out a statistical index on education whereby educational facilities are evaluated in numbers from 0 to 100, moving from the poorest to the most advanced. On that index, most African countries are below 10. The developed exploiter countries and the socialist states are usually above 80. A UNESCO publication on education in Black independent Africa said, of this population, of around 170 million, a little more than 25 million are of school age, and of these, nearly 13 million have no opportunity to going to school, and of the privileged 12 million, less than half complete their primary education. Only 3 out of every 100 children see the inside of a secondary school, while not even 2 of every 1,000 have a chance of receiving some sort of higher education in Africa itself. The overall estimated illiteracy rate of 80 to 85% is nearly twice that of the average world figure. The imperialist whites use that evidence to snigger at Africans for being illiterate natives, and they would argue that illiteracy is part of the vicious circle of poverty. Yet the same people boast proudly that they have educated Africa. It is difficult to see how they can have it both ways. If independent Africa is still without the benefits of modern education, as it is, then 75 years of colonial exploitation undoubtedly has something to do with the state of affairs. The absurdity is so much the greater when one contemplates how much Africa produced in that period and how much of that went to develop all aspects of European capitalist society, including their educational institutions. Cecil Rhodes could afford to leave a legacy of lavish scholarships to white students for study at Oxford University, having made a fortune from exploiting Africa and Africans. Those Africans who had access to education were faced with certain qualitative problems. The quality was poor by prevailing European standards. The books, the methods of teaching, and the discipline were all brought to Africa in the 19th century. On the whole, colonial schools remained sublimely indifferent to the 20th century. New ideas that were incorporated in the capitalist metropoles never reached the colonies. In particular, the fantastic changes in science did not reach African classrooms, for there were few schools where science subjects were taught. Similarly, the evolution of higher technical education did not have any counterpart in colonial Africa. There were numerous absurdities in the transplantation of a version of European education into Africa. When the Dimba children just mentioned went to school, they had no program of instruction relating to the plant life with which they would otherwise have familiarized themselves. Instead, they were taught about flowers and about European roses at that. Dr. Koli Busia, some years ago, made the following admission. At the end of my first year at secondary school, in Fansiprim, Cape Coast, Ghana, I went home to Winchi for the Christmas vacation. I had not been home for 4 years, and on that visit I became painfully aware of my isolation. I understood our community far less than the boys of my own age who had never been to school. Over the years, as I went through college and university, I felt increasingly that the education I received taught me more and more about Europe, and less about my own society. Eventually, Busia knew so little about African society that he proposed that independent Africans should dialogue with the fascist/racist white minority that maintains apartheid in South Africa. Some of the contradictions between the content of colonial education and the reality of Africa were really incongruous. In a hot afternoon in some tropical African school, a class of black shining faces would listen to their geography lesson on the seasons of the year. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter. They would learn about the Alps and the River Rhine, but nothing about the Atlas Mountains of North Africa or the River Zambezi. If those students were in a British colony, they would dutifully write that we defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, at a time when Hawkins was stealing Africans and being knighted by Queen Elizabeth I for so doing. If they were in a French colony, they would learn that the Gauls, our ancestors, had blue eyes, and they would be convinced that Napoleon was our greatest general. The same Napoleon who reinstituted slavery in the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, and was only prevented from doing the same in Haiti because his forces were defeated by an even greater strategist and tactician, the African Toussaint Louverture. To some extent, Europeans thoughtlessly applied their own curricula without reference to African conditions, but very often they deliberately did so with intent to confuse and mystify. As late as 1949, a principal education officer in Tanganyika carefully outlined that the Africans of that colony should be bombarded in primary school with propaganda about the British royal family. The theme of the British king as father should be stressed throughout the syllabus and mentioned in every lesson, he said. He further urged that African children should be shown numerous pictures of the English princesses and their ponies at Sandringham and Windsor Castle. Whatever little was discussed about the African past in colonial schools was about European activities in Africa. That trend is now sufficiently reversed to allow the present generation of African pupils to smile at the thought that Europeans discovered Mount Kenya or the River Niger. But in the colonial period, the paradox was that whoever had an opportunity to be educationally misguided could count himself lucky, because that misguidance was a means of personal advance within the structure created by European capitalists in and for Africa. The French, Portuguese, and Belgians made it clear that education at any level was designed to civilize the African native. And of course, only a civilized native could hope to gain worthwhile employment and recognition from the colonialists. According to the French, an African, after receiving French education, stood a chance of becoming an assimilé, one who could be assimilated or incorporated into the superior French culture. The Portuguese used the word assimilado, which means exactly the same, and Portuguese colonial law distinguished sharply between a native and an assimilado. The latter was sometimes called a civilizado because of being able to read and write Portuguese. That sort of African was rewarded with certain privileges. One great irony was that in Portugal, up to 1960, nearly half the population was illiterate, and therefore, if they had been put to the same test, they would have been judged uncivilized. Meanwhile, the Belgians were parading around with the same system. They called their educated Bantu in Congo the Evolui, those who have evolved from savagery to civilization thanks to the Belgians. Somehow, the British avoided hard and fast legal distinctions between the educated and uneducated African, but they encouraged cultural imitation all the same. Governor Cameron of Tanganyika in the 1920s was known as a progressive governor, but when he was attacked for trying to preserve the African personality in the educational system, he denied the charge and declared that his intention was that the African should cease to think as an African and instead should become a fair-minded Englishman. Students who came out of Livingstonia or Blantyre Mission in Malawi were known as Black Scotsmen because of the effort of Scottish missionaries. In Sierra Leone, the white cultural influence went back to the 18th century, and Sierra Leonean Creoles stood out even from the rest of miseducated black people. The Creoles were not satisfied with an English Christian name, or even with one European surname. They had to choose two European surnames and connect them with a hyphen. Of course, in practical terms, the education with all its warped values meant that the educated handful went as far as colonialism would allow Africans to go in the civil service or in the employ of private capitalist firms. During the colonial epoch and afterwards, criticism was justly leveled at the colonial educational system for failing to produce more secondary school pupils and more university graduates. And yet it can be said that among those who had the most education were to be found the most alienated Africans on the continent. Those were the ones who evolved and were assimilated. At each further stage of education, they were battered by and succumbed to the values of the white capitalist system, and after being given salaries, they could then afford to sustain a style of life imported from outside. Access to knives and forks, three-piece suits, and pianos then further transformed their mentality. There is a famous West Indian calypsonian who, in satirizing his colonial school days, remarked that had he been a bright student, he would have learned more and turned out to be a fool. Unfortunately, the colonial school system educated far too many fools and clowns, fascinated by the ideas and way of life of the European capitalist class. Some reached a point of total estrangement from African conditions and the African way of life, and like Blaise Diagne of Senegal, they chirped happily that they were and would always be European. There is no getting away from the conclusion reached by the African educationalist Abdo Malmouni that colonial education corrupted the thinking and sensibilities of the African and filled him with abnormal complexes. It followed that those who were Europeanized were to that extent de-Africanized as a consequence of the colonial education and the general atmosphere of colonial life. Many examples are cited in present-day Africa of the insulting treatment of aspects of African culture in the colonial period, based on cultural imperialism and white racism. What is seldom commented upon is the fact that many Africans were the victims of fascism at the hands of the Portuguese and Spanish, at the hands of the Italians and the Vichy French regime for a brief period in the late 1930s and the early 1940s, and at the hands of the British and Boers in South Africa throughout this century. The fascist colonial powers were retarded capitalist states, where the government police machinery united with the Catholic Church and the capitalists to suppress Portuguese and Spanish workers and peasants and to keep them ignorant. Understandably, the fascist colonialists wanted to do the same to African working people, and in addition, they vented their racism on Africans, just as Hitler had done on the Jews. Like most colonial administrations, that of the Italians in Libya disregarded the culture of the Africans. However, after the fascist Mussolini came to power, the disregard gave way to active hostility, especially in relation to the Arabic language and the Muslim religion. The Portuguese and Spanish had always shown contempt for African language and religion. Schools of kindergarten and primary level for Africans in Portuguese colonies were nothing but agencies for the spread of the Portuguese language. Most schools were controlled by the Catholic Church, as a reflection of the unity of church and state in fascist Portugal. In the little-known Spanish colony of Guinea, Rio Muni, the small amount of education given to Africans was based on eliminating the use of local languages by the pupils and on instilling in their hearts the holy fear of God. Schools in colonial Africa were usually blessed with the names of saints or bestowed with the names of rulers, explorers, and governors from the colonizing power. In Spanish Guinea, that practice was followed, resulting in the fact that Rio Muni children had to pass by the José Antonio School, the equivalent of saying the Adolf Hitler School if the region were German, for the school was named in honor of José Antonio, the founder of the Spanish Fascist Party. Another aspect of the colonial educational and cultural patterns which needs investigation is the manner in which European racism and contempt was expressed not only by hostility to African culture, but by paternalism and by praise of negative and static social features. There were many colonialists who wished to preserve in perpetuity everything that was African, if it appeared quaint or intriguing to them. Such persons merely succeeded in cutting African life off from the potentially beneficial aspects of the international world. An excellent example is the kind of work done in Gabon by Albert Schweitzer, who was in charge of a dirty, unhygienic hospital with dogs, cats, goats, and chickens running around under the guise of fitting into the African culture and environment. As late as 1959, a friend and colleague of Albert Schweitzer defended his unsterile hospital in the following terms. Now to the domestic animals at the hospital. People have been shocked by the informality with which animals and people mix. And although it is perhaps not always defensible on hygienic grounds, the mixture adds considerably to the charm of the place. The writer was a dental surgeon from New York, who would obviously have had a fit if a goat or chicken had wandered into his New York surgery. He knew full well that at Schweitzer's hospital the goats, dogs, and cats visit hospital wards teeming with microbial life of the most horrifying varieties. But he defended their habitation with Africans because that was part of the culture and charm that had to be preserved. In the educational sphere, the Belgians carried out a language policy which might appeal to contemporary nationalists, for they insisted that primary education should be in one of the 5 main African languages of the territory. However, in practice, they used that apparently progressive decision to seal off one Congolese ethnic group from another and to cut the educated off from a wider world of knowledge, because the missionaries translated into the local languages only that which they thought desirable. The policy of mock respect for African culture reached its highest expression in South Africa in the notorious Bantu Education Act of 1953, which sought to promote the differences between Zulu, Sotho, Xhosa, Venda, and so on. Differences which were part of an early stage of development and which would have been transcended if there were no European intervention, or if under white rule specific steps were not taken to maintain the anachronistic tribal entities. Not all colonial educators and administrators were consciously taking up the position that the African should be educated the better to be enslaved. On the contrary, most of them thought that they were doing Africans a great favor, and there were a few who were enlightened enough to realize that there was scope for devising a school program which was less divorced from African reality. In 1928, even the French education minister was shocked to learn that Africans were taught that the Gauls, their ancestors, had blue eyes. From the 1920s, both Britain and France produced colonial educators and education commissions which urged greater relevance of teaching programs in Africa. They also put forward suggestions such as the use of local languages in primary schools, more education for girls, and an end to the white-collar orientation of schooling. However, the seemingly progressive nature of those recommendations could not change the fact that colonial education was an instrument to serve the European capitalist class in its exploitation of Africa. Whatever colonial educators thought or did could not change that basic fact. To recommend that African girls should go to school is more than just an educational policy. It has tremendous social implications, and it presupposes that the society will usefully employ the educated woman. Metropolitan capitalist society itself had failed to liberate women, to offer them equal educational opportunities, or to provide them with responsible jobs at equal rates of pay with men. That being the case, it was wishful thinking to imagine that the colonial educational system would take any serious interest in African women, especially since the colonialists would have had to transform the consciousness on that matter which was characteristic of feudal and pre-feudal societies. Nowhere did the cash crop economy or the export of basic ores make provisions for educated women. As in the capitalist metropoles, it was assumed that the civil service was for men. Therefore, the extremely limited employment sector in the colonies had nothing to offer educated women, and modern education remained a luxury with which few African women came into contact. Another progressive suggestion made by some colonial educationalists was for more agricultural and technical schooling. But genuine technical education was ruled out because the fundamental purpose of the colonial economy did not permit the development of industry and skills within Africa. Only in rare cases, such as in the Congo, was there an objective necessity for technically trained Africans. In the later stages of colonial rule in Congo, mineral exploitation had developed to such a point that there was practical need for extensive rudimentary technical skills among African workers. A few Kalangis and other Congolese also received technical training of a secondary equivalent. Significantly enough, in such cases, the private companies took the initiative, since their profits were at stake, and the technical schools were extensions of their production processes. However, for the most part, whatever skilled jobs needed to be done within the restricted field of mining and industry in Africa were met by the importation of Europeans. Agriculture was not carried on as a scientific industry, as in Scandinavia or New Zealand, where whites were farming on an intensive capitalist basis. As noted earlier, the production of cash crops in Africa was stimulated by the minimum expenditure on the part of Europeans, and with no infusion of new technology. Therefore, when educational advisors suggested agricultural education relevant to African needs, this meant no addition to African knowledge. In many colonial schools, agriculture became an apology for a subject. It was part of the drudgery of the institution. The teachers received no agricultural education, and therefore they could not teach anything scientific. Children acquired nothing but distaste for the heavy labor of shamba work, and in fact it was used as a form of punishment. Early educational commissions also accorded high priority to religious and moral flavoring of instruction, something that was disappearing in Europe itself. The role of the Christian Church in the educational process obviously needs special attention. The Christian missionaries were as much part of the colonizing forces as were the explorers, traders, and soldiers. There may be room for arguing whether in a given colony the missionaries brought the other colonialist forces, or vice versa, but there is no doubting the fact that missionaries were agents of colonialism in the practical sense, whether or not they saw themselves in that light. The imperialist adventurer Sir Henry Johnston disliked missionaries, but he conceded in praise of them that each mission station is an exercise in colonization. In Europe, the Church had long held a monopoly over schooling from feudal times, right into the capitalist era. By the late 19th century, that situation was changing in Europe, but as far as the European colonizers were concerned, the Church was free to handle the colonial educational system in Africa. The strengths and weaknesses of that schooling were very much to be attributed to the Church. Both inside and outside church and school, the personnel of the Church were instrumental in setting values during the colonial epoch. They taught an ethic of human relations that in itself could appeal to the finer instincts of Africans, just as it had previously stirred other Europeans. Of course, there was a huge gap between European conduct and the Christian principles with which they were associated, and on the part of the Africans, it was also true that motives for accepting Christianity often had nothing to do with the content of the religion. Indeed, the Church as a source of education was probably more attractive to many converts than the Church as a dispenser of religion. Whatever the Church taught in any capacity may be considered as a contribution to formal and informal education in colonial Africa, and its teachings must be placed within a social context. The Church's role was primarily to preserve the social relations of colonialism, as an extension of the role it played in preserving the social relations of capitalism in Europe. Therefore, the Christian Church stressed humility, docility, and acceptance. Ever since the days of slavery in the West Indies, the Church had been brought in on condition that it should not excite the African slaves with doctrines of equality before God. In those days, they taught slaves to sing that all things were bright and beautiful, and that the slave master in his castle was to be accepted as God's work, just like the slave living in a miserable hovel and working 20 hours per day under the whip. Similarly, in colonial Africa, churches could be relied upon to preach turning the other cheek in the face of exploitation, and they drove home the message that everything would be right in the next world. Only the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa was openly racist, but all others were racist insofar as their European personnel were no different from other whites who had imbibed racism and cultural imperialism as a consequence of the previous centuries of contact between Europeans and the rest of the world. In serving colonialism, the Church often took up the role of arbiter of what was culturally correct. African ancestral beliefs were equated with the devil, who was black anyway, and it took a very long time before some European churchmen accepted prevailing African beliefs as constituting religion rather than mere witchcraft and magic. However, in its hostility towards African cultural and religious manifestations, the Christian Church did perform certain progressive tasks. Practices such as killing twins and trial by ordeal were frowned upon by the European missionaries, and those were reflections of superstitious ideas rooted in an early stage of African development, when something like the birth of twins could not be scientifically explained, and therefore gave rise to religious fear. It is to be noted that in West Africa, long before the colonial scramble, many outcasts in society and persons who suffered from religious and social prejudices were the first converts of the Christian Church. What was supported by one section of the population was opposed by another, and in the present century, the cultural imperialism of the Church excited great opposition. Prevailing African customs such as polygamy were attacked without reference to their socio-economic function. On the question of monogamy, the Christian missionaries were introducing not a religious principle, but rather a facet of European capitalist society. For their propaganda to have been successful, European activity had to work a transformation in the extended family patterns of African societies. That was very slow in occurring, and in the meanwhile, many Africans accepted the religious aspects while rejecting the cultural appendages and the European missionaries themselves. Much has been written about the trend in colonial Africa known as the Independent Church Movement. It was a trend in which thousands of African Christians participated by breaking away from European churches, especially Protestant churches, and setting up their own places of worship under Christian African leadership. The motives were varied. Some independent churches were highly nationalistic, like that established by John Chilembwe, who led an armed nationalist uprising in Nyasaland, Malawi, in 1917. Others developed a response of those Africans aspiring to be priests or pastors to the discrimination practiced against them by white missionaries. One constant factor was disgust with the way that Europeans forced Africans to identify as Europeans. Revolting against that concept, one Zulu independent church put the question to the local population: are you a Jew or a Zulu? Were you there when they crucified their Lord? Nevertheless, many Africans came to accept the dehumanizing principle of alienation from self. African identification with Europeans, be they Gentile or Jew, was a pillar of the informal education of the colonial epoch. In the final analysis, perhaps the most important principle of colonial education was that of capitalist individualism. Like many aspects of the superstructure of beliefs in a society, it had both its negative and positive sides, viewed historically. The European bourgeoisie were progressive when they defended the individual from the excessive control of the father in the family and against the collective regulations of the church and feudal society. However, the capitalist system then went on to champion and protect the rights of the individual property owners against the rights of the mass of exploited workers and peasants. When capitalism had its impact on Africa in the colonial period, the idea of individualism was already in its reactionary phase. It was no longer serving to liberate the majority, but rather to enslave the majority for the benefit of a few. When individualism was applied to land, it meant that the notions of private ownership and the transfer of land through sale became prevalent in some parts of the continent. Much more widespread was the new understanding that individual labor should benefit the person concerned, and not some wider collective, such as the clan or ethnic group. Thus, the practice of collective labor and egalitarian social distribution gave way to accumulative tendencies. Superficially, it appeared that individualism brought progress. Some individuals owned large coffee, cocoa, or cotton shambas, and others rose to some prominence in the colonial administration through education. As individuals, they had improved their lot, and they became models of achievement within the society. Any model of achievement is an educational model, which directs the thoughts and actions of young and old in the society. The model of personal achievement under colonialism was really a model for the falling apart of the underdevelopment of African society taken as a whole. It is a common myth within capitalist thought that the individual, through drive and hard work, can become a capitalist. In the United States, it is usual to refer to an individual like John D. Rockefeller Sr. as someone who rose from rags to riches. To complete the moral of the Rockefeller success story, it would be necessary to fill in the details on all the millions of people who had to be exploited in order for one man to become a multimillionaire. The acquisition of wealth is not due to hard work alone, or the Africans working as slaves in America and the West Indies would have been the wealthiest group in the world. The individualism or the capitalist must be seen against the hard and unrewarded work of the masses. The idea of individualism was more destructive in colonial Africa than it was in metropolitan capitalist society. In the latter, it could be said that the rise of the bourgeois class indirectly benefited the working class through promoting technology and raising the standard of living. But in Africa, colonialism did not bring those benefits. It merely intensified the rate of exploitation of African labor and continued to export the surplus. In Europe, individualism led to entrepreneurship and adventurism of the type which spearheaded Europe's conquest of the rest of the world. In Africa, both the formal school system and the informal value system of colonialism destroyed social solidarity and promoted the worst form of alienated individualism without social responsibility. That delayed the political process through which the society tried to regain its independence. Up to this point, it has consistently been held that development is rooted in the material environment, in the techniques of production, and in the social relations deriving from people's work. There are what are known as conspiracy theories of history, by which the happenings of whole epochs are presented as being the secret scheming of one group or another. Such an approach is not to be recommended in the study of Africa's relations with Europe. However, with regard to colonial educational policy, one comes closest to finding the elements of conscious planning by a group of Europeans to control the destiny of millions of Africans over a considerable period of time, extending into the future. The planning of colonial education for the subjugation of Africa was most fully displayed by the French, because French politicians and administrators had the habit of openly expressing their thoughts on Africa. Therefore, the words of the French colonialists themselves will be cited here to illustrate how the colonial educational system did not leave vital political matters to chance, but was consciously carrying out policies hostile to the regaining of freedom by African peoples. Ever since the period of the imperialistic scramble for Africa, French leaders realized that it was imperative to start some schools in the parts of Africa claimed by France, so that French language and culture might be accepted by some Africans, who would then identify with France, rather than Britain or Portugal, or some other European rival. This was particularly true in disputed frontier zones. Eugene Etienne, a French minister at the start of the colonial era, stated that the extension of the French language was necessary as a measure of national defense. As early as 1884, there was set up the Alliance Française, as all instrument of educational and cultural imperialism recognized and supported by the French government. The reports of the Alliance Française shows clearly that they thought of themselves as an arm of French imperialism, fighting so that France could entrench itself. For example, the Alliance Française wrote of French schools in Upper Guinea in the late 19th century. They have to combat the redoubtable influence of the English schools of Sierra Leone in this region. Their struggle between the two languages becomes more intense as one moves to the south, invaded by English natives and by their Methodist pastors. The spread of the language of the European colonizing power was considered a major importance. Belgium, on the other hand, encouraged local languages as a means of division and retardation. Only in Tanganyika, under German rule, was there a positive reaction to the potentialities of Swahili as a teaching language, so that there was a further impetus to that language, which had already spread by trade, politic relations, and personal contacts. Apart from language, the pillar of cultural imperialism in most colonies was religion. The Church never played as important a role in French colonies as it did in other parts of Africa colonized by predominantly Catholic countries, and the Protestant churches in British colonies also had a much more vital role than the Church in French Africa. The explanation is that the French bourgeois revolution of the 18th century was more thoroughly anti-clerical than any other bourgeois revolution, and the Catholic Church was completely separated from government in France by 1905, after many years of poor relations. Nevertheless, when the French saw that mission schools were helping England to entrench itself in Africa, the French government asked the aid of their own Catholic Church to secure national interests. From the viewpoint of the colonizers, once the frontiers of a colony were firmly decided, the major problem remained that of securing African compliance and carrying out policies favorable to the metropoles. There was always a possible use of force for that purpose, but naked force was best kept in reserve, rather than utilized for everyday affairs. Only education could lay the basis for a smooth functioning colonial administration. In the first place, there was the elementary language problem of Europeans communicating with Africans. Most of the time Europeans used translators to pass on orders, but it was known that African translators seized the opportunity to promote themselves and to modify or even sabotage orders. There was a saying in French colonial Africa that translation is equal to treason, and the only way to avoid that was to teach the mass of the people French. Then there was the practical aspect of educating Africans to be better workers, just as in Europe the workers received education so that they would be more efficient and produce extra surplus for the capitalists. In colonial Africa, the European bourgeoisie realized that some education would maximize the value of labor. Albert Sarraute, a French colonial minister, stressed in 1914 that he termed the economic utility of educating the African masses. Several years earlier, the French had made a specific statement to the same effect on Madagascar. An ordinance of 1899 indicated that the purpose of schooling was to make the young Malagasy faithful and obedient subjects of Franco, and to offer an education which would be industrial, agricultural, and commercial, so as to ensure that the settlers and various public services of the colony can meet their personnel requirements. In practice, it was not necessary to educate the masses because only a minority of the African population entered the colonial economy in such a way that their performance could be enhanced by education. Indeed, the French concentrated on selecting a small minority who would be thoroughly subjected to French cultural imperialism and who would aid France in administering its vast African colonial possessions. William Ponty, an early governor-general of French West Africa, spoke in terms of forming an elite of young people destined to aid our own efforts. In 1919, Henry Simon, then colonial minister, outlined a program for secondary education in Africa with a view to making the best indigenous elements into complete Frenchmen. The best expressions of the political implications of French colonial educational policy came in the 1930s, and by that time some action was also matching the words. Brévier, the Governor-General of French West Africa in 1930, urged the extension of the higher levels of primary schooling for Africans to help us in our work of colonization. Brévier was encouraged by the fact that by then there had appeared a native elite, of whose zeal for a thorough and exclusive French culture signs are already visible. So with the support of the Inspector General of Education, that governor went on to outline plans for African students to attend secondary school so as to become colonial cadres. That was the role played by the youngest age grades in Shaka's armies, and it was the role played by the Komsomol, or young communists, in the Soviet Union. Being a cadre involved not just training for a practical job, but also political orientation to serve as a leading element in the system. The French and other colonialists understood this very well. This is how Brévier expressed it. It is in no wise merely a matter of turning out hatches of apprentices, clerks, and officials according to the fluctuating needs of the moment. The role of these native cadres is much wider. Only in North Africa, with its heavy white settler population, did the French find it unnecessary to encourage a local elite to run affairs under the direction of the metropolis and the governor. Although even in Algeria, there emerged a number of subjects called the Beni Oui Oui, literally the yes-yes men, who always assented to carrying out French instructions in opposition to the interests of most of their brothers. Another far-sighted aspect of French political policy in the education sphere is the manner in which they forced the sons of chiefs to acquire education. It was a deliberate attempt to capture the loyalty of those persons who had previously held political power in independent Africa, and it was an attempt at continuity with the pre-colonial phase. As the French themselves put it, by educating the sons of traditional rulers, a bond is thus established between the native cadres formed by us and those that the native community recognizes. In 1935, a team of British educationalists visited French Africa, and they admitted, with a mixture of jealousy and admiration, that France had succeeded in creating an elite of Africans in the image of Frenchmen, an elite that was helping to perpetuate French colonial rule. To greater or lesser extent, all colonial powers produced similar cadres to manage and buttress their colonial empires in Africa and elsewhere. After the Second World War, it became obvious that colonial rule could not forever be maintained in the same form in Africa, Asia already having broken loose, and Africa being restless. When the awareness that the end was in sight became generalized, the metropolitan powers turned to their colonial cadres and handed to them the reins of policy in politically independent Africa. It should be emphasized that the choice that Africa should be free was not made by the colonial powers, but by the people of Africa. Nevertheless, the changeover from colonialism to what is known as neo-colonialism did have the element of conspiracy in it. In 1960, the then British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan made the oft-quoted statement that a wind of change was blowing across Africa. That was the bourgeois way of expressing what Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai was soon to assert, namely that Africa was ripe for revolution. In order to delay or hijack the African Revolution, the colonizing powers turned to a group which they had already created for a different purpose: the elite of colonially educated Africans, from among whom were selected wherever possible those who were most suitable for elevation to political leadership, and the administration and military apparatus were left in the hands of similar trustworthy cadres. There were a few far-sighted Europeans who all along saw that the colonial educational system would serve them if and when political independence was regained in Africa. For instance, Pierre Fontaine, a founder of the Alliance Française, started at the beginning of this century that it is necessary to attach the colonies to the metropole by a very solid psychological bond against the day when their progressive emancipation ends in a form of federation, as is probable, that they be and they remain French in language, thought, and spirit. Yet it was the British who first appreciated that they should bow to the inevitable and grant African independence. While the French introduced a few African representatives into their own parliament in France, so as to try and keep African territories tied to France, the British began to prepare to hand over to certain selected Africans. In the metropolitan capitalist countries, there were, and still are, elite schools which provided the bulk of the political and other leadership. The English public schools of Eton, Harrow, Rugby, and Winchester are well known as training grounds of the British ruling class, and by many authorities they are considered more important than the universities to which the students of such secondary schools invariably go. In France, at the secondary level, it was and still is usual to find that students emerging from places like the Lycée Louis-le-Grand and the École Normale Supérieure Rue du Lym are the future cabinet ministers and top executives of that country. In the United States, in spite of the myth that everyone can reach the top, a high proportion of the ruling class went to exclusive schools like the private boys' schools of Groton, St. Paul's, St. Mark's, and Phillips Exeter. Under African conditions, anyone who went to school in the colonial period virtually entered the elite, because the numbers enjoying that privilege even at the primary level were so small. In addition, within each colony, there tended to be at least one secondary school or higher institute which played the role of furnishing the political administrative personnel of Africa in the era of political independence. The names of cabinet ministers and permanent secretaries of individual African countries can be found on the school rolls of Gordon College, Sudan; Alliance High School, Kenya; King's College, Budo, Uganda; Tabora Secondary School, Tanzania; Livingstonia, Malawi; William Ponty, Senegal; Sierra Leone Grammar School; Infantsipim, Ghana; Liliyi Ngelieni, Madagascar, and a few others. Besides, there were Makerere, Fura Bay, and Achimota as long-standing university or near-university institutions. In retrospect, it is now very clear that one of the most significant aspects of the colonial education system was that provided by the armed forces and police. Colonial armies such as the King's African Rifles, the French Free Army, and the Congolese Force Publique produced sergeants who later became the majors and generals of independent Africa and, in several instances, the heads of states. Policemen also achieved similar rapid promotion, although their political position has been rather weaker than the military proper. Like their civilian counterparts, the future police and military elite were at one time trained to be simply low-level assistants to the colonial overlords, but once independence was in sight, they were judged by the colonizers to have the requisite qualities of colonial cadres, fit to be part of the ruling class of neo-colonial Africa. In a few instances, the colonial powers towards the latter part of the colonial period rushed to train a few Africans at the metropolitan higher institutions of scientific violence, notably Sandhurst Military Academy and Hendon Police School, Britain, and St. Cyr Military Academy in France. Those few who were selected for such training became the cream of the military elite, corresponding to those African civilians who went to university either in Africa or abroad. Most of what emerged from the colonial educational system was not unique. Educational systems are designed to function as props to a given society, and the educated in the young age groups automatically carry over their values when their turn comes to make decisions in the society. In Africa, the colonialists were training low-level administrators, teachers, NCOs, and railroad booking clerks for the preservation of colonial relations. And it is not surprising that such individuals would carry over colonial values into the period after independence was regained. The colonialists, meanwhile, took action wherever possible to ensure that persons most favorable to their position continued to man African administrations and assumed new political and state police powers. Such a presentation of events would be termed one-sided by many Europeans and Africans, too. In a sense, that is true, and the one-sidedness is deliberate. It is a presentation of what the colonial educational system achieved in terms of what it set itself to achieve. The other side of the matter is not the good with which colonial educators can be credited, but rather the good that emerged, in spite of the efforts and intentions of the colonizers, and because of the struggles of African people.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.